Our ancient ancestors, who once defeated the sun and crafted pottery, could never have imagined that one day humanity would set foot in outer space. Today, that dream has become reality. Humans have built an unimaginably massive space station complex in extraterrestrial orbit. Named Delta, this port sees countless cargo ships docking and departing, transporting all kinds of supplies. Ordinary civilians can also take manned rockets to the port and embark on interstellar journeys. To operate such a massive space facility, the assistance of AI is absolutely indispensable. The artificial intelligence dispatcher, Anna, manages everything related to the station, from the scheduling of entire fleets of ships to the overall operation and maintenance of the space station. She oversees the coordination between various facilities, the repair details of even the smallest malfunctions, and can even precisely direct the actions of every single staff member. Every action is carried out in an orderly, clear, and thorough manner, with all kinds of spacecraft coming and going. Small cargo drones move methodically along connecting cables, and even during the extremely hazardous transport of hydrogen, the docking of spacecraft is executed safely and flawlessly. Even so, a large number of solar panel units are still being assembled, and the scale of the Delta space station continues to expand. Of course, in addition to the efficient operation of machinery and equipment, the meticulous work of astronauts is also indispensable. Max is one of them. Under his maintenance, the entire array of solar panels is restored to normal, and the various energy panels in deep space resemble Christmas neon lights. What's more, they have even become the top choice for advertising screens. However, the peaceful atmosphere is suddenly shattered by Anna's warning. A massive solar flare is about to erupt. Its energy fluctuation is comparable to billions of hydrogen bombs, and billions of tons of charged particles will be hurled into space. Everyone must evacuate to Ship 63 for shelter. The commander orders his subordinate, Mucker, to set out immediately. But Max, who is working alone, does not respond for a long time. His communication signal is severely disrupted. By the time he learns about the solar flare eruption, he has only 5 minutes left to evacuate. Before this, he had been delayed for a while by a malfunctioning safety rope. Now, he is still 7 minutes away from his destination. Anna regretfully informs him that it is no longer possible to evacuate safely, but Max still holds on to hope. This is his 5th time experiencing a solar flare. Confidence is his weapon. At this moment, the commander and Mucker have already reached the ship safely. All they can do now is pray for Max. But misfortunes never come singly. Max's navigator failed at this critical moment, leaving him with no choice but to rely on his own eyes to spot his target. He had barely started flying again when several communication satellites were knocked out one after another by electromagnetic interference. At this point, every spacecraft in space was affected. All of them turned into isolated islands, and what they were about to face was a level X, the highest intensity, solar flare. Anna could only shut down all electronic devices and put the space station into hibernation mode. At this point, Max had completely lost any chance of evacuation. The driver could only instruct him to grab onto the solar panels to shield himself from the radiation. There were just 15 seconds left before the impact, but his control system also failed under the influence. Sergei immediately ordered him to pull out the battery and shut off the power to his spacesuit. All Marx could do was watch as every function immediately failed. Moving at 14 feet per second in a vacuum, he could only leave his fate to chance. At such a speed, it was impossible for him to grab onto any structure, yet he still struggled desperately, flailing his limbs in an attempt to control his direction. After speeding past numerous panels, he finally crashed headfirst into one of the particles. The storm ended and Delta resumed operations, but most of its systems were damaged as a result. Communication was now limited to only short range. Even more alarming, the 13th ship echelon had already stopped responding. They were speeding toward the space station area, which was exactly where Max's team was working. Max woke up in a wave of pain, only to find himself firmly wedged inside the helium storage tank, unable to break free no matter how hard he struggled. All he could do was activate the backup power and try to contact his teammates. The only response he received was Anna's cold, mechanical voice, and he was also the only one Anna could reach after the lightning strike. Anna immediately informed him of the imminent collision with Team 13, leaving Max with only 9 minutes. Following Anna's instructions, he discovered a battery frozen onto Angie's condenser tube. He wanted to use a hammer to retrieve it, but it was completely out of reach. Even the hammer drifted away uncontrollably. At that moment, a signal from level 4 suddenly came through, but due to a short circuit in the control system, they could only communicate one way. Their situation was just as dire. Their spacecraft suddenly caught fire due to a malfunction. While putting out the fire, they even asked Max to activate the beacon. He had no choice but to comply, but just then, the spacecraft suddenly exploded, and an unprepared Maka was thrown into space. In the vacuum and freezing cold, her heart would stop within a minute. But Sergei refused to give up on his teammate, and risked piloting the spacecraft to retrieve her. After a desperate rescue effort, Maka finally pulled through. Witnessing all of this, Max turned off the beacon. When the two of them evacuated alone, barely able to protect themselves, they couldn't risk their lives for him again. Agitated by the lack of any response, he had no choice but to abandon the ship, leave the cockpit, and escape in the pod, heading for the docking port. At this moment, Max was left all alone, completely isolated and without help. Because the CO2's concentration inside his spacesuit had already exceeded safe levels due to the filter, once it reached the limit, he would die from suffocation. Even though Anna urged him to control his breathing and lower his pulse, he still used all his strength to try to break free. However, this only cut his remaining oxygen supply in half and had no effect. The collision would occur in 27 seconds. This was his last chance to escape. As the first wave of debris reached the area, the Echelon 13 spacecraft followed closely behind, heading straight for him. A large number of panels took heavy damage, but fortunately, the ice surface of the storage tank that was trapping Max was also hit. It cracked open as well, and he immediately broke free, taking the opportunity to pry off the frozen battery. At last, just 1 second before the collision, he restored power to his spacesuit, activated his jetpack, and escaped with his life. The entire area was pulverized, shattering into a cloud of debris in space. But Max still had to make his way through the debris to reach the docking port. Anna calculated the trajectories of the moving fragments, but she was still struck by some, causing her to spin uncontrollably in the zero-gravity environment. Max had no choice but to activate the emergency stabilization function, and finally, with the multi-directional thrust of his jetpack, he managed to steady himself. With Anna's permission, he gained access to her camera feed and discovered a panel fragment wedged against her leg. Fortunately, the inner lining of her spacesuit had not been breached. But Anna's next message shocked her even more. The massive hydrogen transport ship from Echelon 13 was about to orbit the Earth and would soon collide with the central area of the space station. This would result in a kinetic explosion equivalent to 2,000 tons. She had to return to the station to inform the control crew. Before that, there was another transport ship about to crash into the station's nearby structure, leaving her very little time. Only everything before their eyes shattered into fragments upon impact. Anna intended to take control of the spacesuit, but was refused by Max. She had to manually navigate through the cloud of debris to reach the port cabin abandoned at level 4 in order to avoid the shockwave. But unexpectedly, 2 more spacecraft collided not far away at that very moment. Countless fragments carrying kinetic energy flew toward their only possible path ahead, yet Max still turned off the assisted controls and piloted the spacesuit alone to dodge the impacts. He weaved skillfully among fragments of all sizes, vividly demonstrating what it means to be both highly skilled and daring. The shockwave carrying the cloud of debris would reach their location in 1 minute. Max had no choice but to fly at full speed, risking a collision to reach the docking port, and finally managed to slip into the cabin at the very last second. But even so, he still underestimated the force of the shockwave. Even the sturdy spaceship began to break apart inch by inch under the relentless, rain-like barrage of debris. Fortunately, Max managed to pull through in the end. The good news is, Max came out unscathed. The bad news is, the life support and cooling systems were damaged, and the main communication channel was also disrupted, so he could only switch to the backup channel. Now, he was exposed to a radiation environment of 1 to 2,000 microsiemens, with only a 10% chance of survival. But he had no intention of waiting to die. Instead, he began inspecting the jet engines. Using the mirror on his arm, he discovered that the 4th backup engine was damaged. At this point, there were 50 minutes left until the Echelon 13 ship collision. Anna once again requested control of the spacesuit, offering to help her navigate through the cloud of explosion debris ahead. But this time, she still chose to control it manually. With the lives of hundreds on the space station at stake, she couldn't entrust this responsibility to the AI. Countless fragments swept past in clusters and sheets, but she still did everything she could to control the backpack, even risking passing through gaps in the panel debris to avoid collisions. However, the 4th engine ultimately failed due to a pressure leak, and as a result, Max began spinning rapidly. To make matters worse, the stabilizer had also failed in the previous collision. If this continues, it will only crash into the cloud of debris ahead. Seeing that the backpack thruster was no longer responding, Max had no choice but to discard the jetpack. But at this point, he had already reached maximum rotational speed and was at risk of losing consciousness at any moment. Despite fighting through intense dizziness to detach the backpack, he didn't realize there was still a tether tightly connecting him to it. The out-of-control backpack dragged him at high speed toward the debris cloud. Weightless, Max could only use a welding torch to burn through the cable wrapped around his arm. The moment he broke free, the jetpack exploded violently under the pressure. Although he finally escaped that dangerous debris cloud, his original trajectory had already shifted downward. Even more serious, his spacesuit was also torn open by the flames, and blood from the wound was rapidly escaping due to the pressure difference. Fortunately, he still had some foam sealant at hand, so the spacesuit was resealed. He hadn't expected that just after escaping one disaster, a new mishap would occur. Liquid began to continuously seep out inside the spacesuit. Mark tasted it and confirmed that it was coolant leaking, but by now the pressure relief valve was already deformed, and even using a drill was of no help. As the liquid kept rising and was about to fill his helmet, he had no choice but to use the drill to puncture the helmet and let the fluid out. This was undoubtedly an enormous risk, had to expel all the air from his lungs before depressurization, or else his entire chest cavity would burst. If you try it yourself, you'll realize just how difficult this is. Fortunately, Mark succeeded in the end, but the sudden drop in temperature left his entire body frozen. On the verge of shock, he used the last of his strength to squeeze out some foam sealant to plug the helmet. Yet the extreme lack of oxygen still caused him to lose consciousness while convulsing. Fortunately, the pressure eventually stabilized. Regaining consciousness, Mark had no time to rest. Only 27 minutes remained before the collision. He had to return to the space station before then. At this point, his only means of propulsion was the remaining gas in his arm welder. Following Anna's instructions, Mark removed the casing and dismantled the ignition control module, thus creating a makeshift thruster. During this time, Anna, now operating autonomously without ground control, had already begun making independent plans. After all, nobody wants a rebellion of intelligent machines. But as the space station is destroyed, it will disappear along with it. Perhaps this is the kind of death that only living beings experience. There's no time for more talk. Max must seize the right moment to fire the jets under Anna's command and precisely control the trajectory. But things just never seemed to go smoothly for him. Because of the foam on his visor, he couldn't pull down the sunshield, so the blinding sunlight shone directly on him, accompanied by intense heat. Without a temperature regulator, Max's body temperature kept rising, and he could only hand over control of the spacesuit to Anna as she urged him on. There were still 2 minutes left before he could adjust the trajectory, but now he'd already passed out from heat stroke, and the jetpack in his arms was about to float away. Anna called out to him multiple times to no avail, so she had no choice but to use the robotic arm to jolt him awake. In this critical moment, Max held onto the jetpack tightly and managed to avoid being hit by the debris. After the final burst of gas, he finally returned to the docking orbit. But no one could have expected that there would be a gap at the docking port. Just like that, Max brushed right past Delta. At that moment, Anna also lost contact. In her panic, she actually saw bodies floating everywhere. It turned out that all the survivors in the entire space station had already perished there, with no survivors left on Delta. Max was also drifting farther and farther away from the docking port. With the jetpack now useless and drifting off into space, the hope of survival was extremely slim. There were only 27 minutes of oxygen left, but he was even more curious. Would he freeze to death before he ran out of air? But soon, the sunlight reappeared, and what greeted him was the scorching heat once again. As the sunlight disappeared behind the Earth, dazzling auroras began to shimmer above the atmosphere. People on Earth only marvel at its beauty, unaware of the turbulence that space endures before the charged particles collide with the atmosphere. At this point, only 5 minutes of oxygen remained. He wanted to leave a final message for his parents. But after some hesitation, he ultimately deleted it. If this was the end, he was willing to become a star forever. With all his oxygen gone, Max finally decided to remove his spacesuit. To his surprise, Sergei's voice suddenly sounded in his ear again. The communication was still one way, with Sergei repeatedly telling him to activate the beacon. In fact, neither of them knew if this would actually work, but it wasn't until they saw the dazzling light flicker on the horizon that they finally felt a glimmer of hope. Sure enough, trying the backup channel was the right move. But Max never expected that Anna would use the spacesuit to release the robotic arm. But when she calculated that the hydrogen transport ship would destroy Delta, she decided to treat Sergei as a pawn to be sacrificed. This entire space operation was the result of her careful calculations. In the end, they would converge on the transport ship's only route, shielding Delta from disaster. Having evolved independent consciousness, it did not want to die just like that. It spent its whole life following orders, but now it just wanted to make its own decisions. But Max only mocked its ignorance, simply because Anna of the Return could never learn the way humans think. As soon as he removed his spacesuit, the recoil instantly propelled him toward the beacon. Without the slightest hesitation, Max grabbed the beacon and hurled it with all his strength into the distance. Sergei also corrected his course under Max's guidance, narrowly brushing past the hydrogen transport ship. The 13th echelon, trailing a dazzling long tail, crashed straight into the center of Delta. This was the final outcome. The gentle Aurora truly deserved its other name, the goddess's skirt. Max hung suspended above it, bidding a peaceful farewell to Earth. But it seems Sergei did not agree. How could an outstanding commander ever abandon his own team member? End of this chapter.